Stanford University.
We're going to talk today about a bunch of different topics related to food, and I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for questions. If there's clarifying questions in between, feel free to jump in, and let's get started, because we have a lot to cover, and I know you have to leave by 9. So there'll be 5 things really to cover today. One is just simply the definitions of what do we mean when we talk about food prices and food security. Let me go back and just introduce this a little bit more by saying we have a center on food security now at Stanford. This is a relatively new thing. The program has existed for a few years. We're just becoming a center. If you'd like more information, let me know. There's a few people here who study these kind of things I'll be talking about today. So the first thing is to talk about just what we mean by food security, what we mean by food prices. Next, I'll talk a little bit about what we've witnessed over the last decade or so. You've probably seen a lot of stories in the news, which is probably part of the reason you're here today. I'll just give a quick overview of that. And then we'll spend most of the time talking about how to understand why prices change, what's the drivers of changes in prices. And then we'll talk about what are the impacts, why do we even care about food prices to begin with. What are some of the things that we study here and elsewhere in terms of the impacts? And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the future. I'm not going to make any firm predictions, of course, because I'm an academic, but I'll try to tell you some of the things to look out for. And it's said that most people retain about 20% of what they hear, so I put 5 things so that you could choose one and be okay. Okay. Food prices. When we talk about food prices, we're actually quite specifically talking about the price typically of a commodity. It doesn't have to be a commodity, but the price of something typically on a specific exchange, like the Chicago Board of Trade for corn or Bangkok for rice. So there's very specific markets that we look to determine the price of food. And we'll be talking about things in terms of dollars per metric tons. If in the US, often it's dollars per bushel. Bushel is a very weird unit which depends on the crop, and like a lot of units in the US, it's pretty unique. But we'll talk mainly about dollars per ton when we talk about international prices. And one thing to point out is that prices in the local markets around the world can often be quite different than the global price. And that's not so much true in the US because we have very good transportation and sort of very efficient distribution systems. But for example, in the middle of Africa, you could pay easily double what the international price is just because of the poor infrastructure, the need to get the commodities from market or from even the regional, from the port for the international market or even from regional centers of production to the point of consumption. Now, I'm going to start. I just realized that this is called classes without quizzes, but I put a bunch of quizzes in my talk. So what? You'll have to forgive me. What do we? Let's like sort of get the ballpark here. What are we talking about when we talk about the price of food? What is a price, say, of a ton of wheat? And no searching on your phone, please. Yeah.
It's about, bushel. It's usually priced in bushels, but it would be, I can't remember the conversion, but it's about $3 or $4 a bushel right now.
Yeah, it's actually, wheat has come down a little. It was up at 6 or 7. I think now it's about 5. But like you, I can never remember the conversion. So what's the, anybody know in terms of a unit that like a pound or a ton? Okay, so here's something just taken off the web. This is just the price at the Kansas exchange for wheat, and this is a price per ton. So $283 per ton. Now think about that for a second. That's about a ton is 1,000 kilos, and a kilo is about a little more than 2 pounds. So we're talking about 30 cents per kilo of wheat, and a kilo of wheat has more than enough calories for a person for a day. Now, obviously, we don't eat just cereals. We don't eat just calories, but that gives you a sense of how cheap food has become. Remarkably cheap. Now, one thing you're probably thinking is I spend a lot more than 30 cents a day or 20 cents a day on food, and that's true. One reason is, of course, we eat other things other than just the staples, so we eat fruit and vegetables and meat. That's part of it, but a bigger part is actually just all of the other things that we pay for when we go to a restaurant or even go to a supermarket. So this is just showing you a figure from the USDA about when we spend $1 on food, what is that dollar actually going to? And you can see only about 10 cents of it actually goes to the farm or to the production of the food. Most of it is in the processing, the retail, the preparation, and things like that. So when we talk about price of food in a developed country, it's a little bit confusing to talk about the food price and versus the price of what you actually pay for food. You had a question?
Yes, food services is food, and I don't understand what that means. The others make sense.
Yeah, think about restaurants there.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so in the US, this could have been a quiz, but we spend, on average, about 6% of our income on food. Now, this is a very different story as you go throughout the world. So the US is sort of the lowest. Any of you have traveled to Europe realize that they spend more on their food there. If you travel to other countries, in many parts of Africa, for example, they'll spend, on average, 40% or 50% of their income. Now, this is on average for the country. The poorest in the country are spending easily 80% of their income on food. Now, this is maybe not surprising to you, but it has some implications for the global markets, which are I think, important to understand, which we'll talk about in a second. But let me just reiterate here how cheap food has become. So this is showing you the price of feeding a person, the amount of calories you would need to feed a person for a year if you were getting those calories from 4 main commodities here: maize or corn, wheat, rice, and soybean. And over time, you can see we're not going to go into the whole story of the Green Revolution and all the innovations in production, but we've seen, as population has grown, as people have gotten wealthier, despite all of that increased demand, we've seen a reduction in the price of food. So much that some of you would, I don't want to get in trouble here, but some of you might have been born, say, in the 60s or maybe even the 50s. You can see that the price of food has come down by a factor of 2 or 3 since then.
Excuse me, those are real prices?
These are real prices, deflated, thank you. So what is the consequence of a very low share of food, of price spent on actual commodities? So we said 6% of food of income in the US is spent on food overall, and only about 10% of that is actually on the commodities. So we're spending a tiny fraction of our money on the commodities, which means essentially that we don't really notice when the price of a commodity changes very much. Okay, we'll notice because it's in the newspaper, but we barely notice. But this is a very different story, and so we would call that we're very inelastic to the price. We don't really respond. But it's a very different story in the developing countries, especially in the poorest parts, where they're spending over half of their income on food. If the price of food doubles and they're already spending over half their income, then they're out of luck. And so this is kind of one of the paradoxes or dilemmas we have in the global food system, is that we have a very inelastic demand globally, but a very elastic demand out of necessity. So demand is kind of one of these funny words that if you can't afford it, then you don't demand it, even if you're starving. So there's this dichotomy in the global food economy that's part of what we try to understand. So it's not obviously just a production issue. It's an income distribution issue. Now let's move to this question of how many people are actually at that other end of the spectrum. So food security is defined in about 100 different ways, but the most classic definition is given here, which is that food security is when you have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. So essentially this means that somewhere in the world the food is produced, so there's a pile of grain big enough for the population, that people have the means to access that food. They're either growing it themselves or they can buy it. And then they have the ability to utilize the nutrients in the food. So the food is nutritious. They don't have some other diseases that prevent them from actually absorbing the nutrients. So these are the aspects of food security, that basically the 3 aspects: availability, access, and utilization. So if we go by that definition and we try to measure this, what are the number of people in the world? So I'll help you out. There's almost about 7 billion people total in the world right now. What fraction or what number of those are what we would call food insecure, which you can think of as basically going to bed hungry? 5 billion out of 7 billion. Wow, you're going to be pleased. Anyone else? Yeah. 3 billion.
A little under 2.
A little under 2. Between 1 and 2. Okay. Well, you guys are actually going to be pleased. It's only about 1 billion people. These estimates are just estimates. It could be as high as, say, 1.5. But we're talking about really just being able to meet your most basic needs. So when you're food secure, it certainly doesn't mean you're in the developed countries. But there's a large number. They're actually still, despite all of the progress in Asia, especially in China, where food security has been achieved almost around the whole country, even in the rural areas. We still have the highest number of people in Asia just because there's so many people in Asia. But in Africa, the rates are the highest. So in Africa, you can easily get in a country, a third to a half of people who are food insecure, meaning they don't really know that they'll have enough food over the next week or so. Okay, now getting to the second part of this. So we've defined food security and food prices. Now let's talk about the last couple of decades. I showed you that dramatic historical decrease in food prices over time. Now that was sort of true up until about 2000. And then in 2000, of course, it's hard to really tell when the trends are changing. There's a lot of variability. But in around 2000, they stopped going down. And then what we saw into 2007 or so, we saw rapid rises in international food prices. And this is the first time I think many of the public really even realized that food prices could go up. Even many analysts were thinking, though, this is just a sort of a historical trajectory. We're on our way to basically free food. And this really surprised a lot of people. The price of food doubled. You can see the baseline here is, I think, 1992 or something. And you can see we're at double that price in terms of real prices, almost double. I don't know if everyone understands the nominal versus real. Nominal is like the actual currency you would pay, but real is deflated for inflation. You can see that this crashed with the economic crash of 2008 that some of you may have heard about, but it actually came back quite quickly, much more quickly than the economy. So the demand for food has been very robust. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's been, yes?
Is that heavily weighted by the fact that the U.S. has such a large economy and it consumes more per capita? Because we've had things like the subsidies for corn, ethanol, and all that impacted some of these things.
Why don't we come back to that? We'll spend a lot of time talking about what's driving these trends. Okay, so one thing you see highly correlated with food prices, if nothing else, is the number of stories about food prices. This is a cool thing you can do with Google now. Put in any term and see the number of searches and also the number of news stories. So you've seen a lot of interest around these price spikes. We certainly get a lot more calls when you see big spikes in prices. This is one of my favorite cover shots from a magazine. They've got these nice tractors spelling out crisis here. What I want to do is give you a little bit of context so that when you read these reports, you understand, I think, what to look for and what's right and what isn't. So obviously, any story you read will give you sort of a range of one single factor to blame versus a total mishmash of things that probably don't even matter. Okay, so we're sort of now at the third part of our outline, and we're going to talk a little bit about supply and demand. This reminds me of the part of the Dr. Seuss book when it says, let's talk about Tweedle Beetles. So we're going to talk about supply and demand. Does this look familiar to anyone? Any of you had an econ in college or since? Okay, this is what we call a supply and demand curve. On the bottom here, we're looking at the quantity of food that's either bought or sold or produced or consumed. And on this axis here, we're looking at price. So this is a very simple concept here. It's just saying that as the price of something goes up, the amount of people or firms willing to produce that will go up. You know, as the price of something goes up, it's more attractive to produce and invest in it and sell it. Conversely, as the price of something goes up, there'll be less people who want to pay for that food or whatever it is. It's not specific to food, right? So you have a downward sloping demand curve. If you increase price, demand goes down. You have an upward sloping supply curve. As you increase price, supply goes up. And there's what we would call a market clearing condition, where the amount that people are willing to sell is equal to the amount that people are willing to buy. And that's what that's the invisible hand. That's the efficient markets that are all achieving this magical price that nobody's there setting. It just emerges from the markets. Now, that's general. But now let's talk a little bit about food in particular. What you see is that supply is a fairly steep curve, meaning as we talked about, it's inelastic. And what that means is it takes a pretty big increase in price for people to start producing a lot more. So if you want to produce more food, one of the ways to do it, for example, is to clear forests and grow more food. You're not going to do that unless you're really convinced that it's worth your while to clear forests, that the price is significantly higher, it's worth all of the cost to clear the forest, and that it'll stay high so that you'll be able to reap the benefits. So it takes quite a while, and even then there's a limited amount of land to increase the supply of food. On the other hand, as we already talked about, demand is also quite inelastic because we're spending really a tiny fraction of our income in the rich world, at least, on food, and the rich world drives a lot of the demand, especially if we include China now in that category. So we have inelastic demand, inelastic supply. What that means is if you, what we would call shock or move one of these, so you could maybe shock supply by having a shortfall in production in a given year because of bad weather, or you could shock demand. For example, if you, let's say hypothetically, decide that you're going to make a policy that requires gasoline producers to use corn ethanol, hypothetically, then what happens is you actually shift these curves. So in this case, you're shifting the demand curve at a given price. Now you're actually, if you go along this line here, at a given price you were demanding this much, but now you're demanding quite a bit more. And so what happens is the curve shifts and your new price is up here. Everybody see that? Supply is similarly, if you were to shift supply back, okay, at this price, say this P0, you were willing to supply this much, but now you can only supply this much because your technologies or your weather conditions or whatever weren't as favorable. So now the price, again, shifts up here. So this sort of lays the framework for what we have to think about when we think about price changes. It's supply or demand, and it's always going to be, or almost always going to be, a combination of the two. So let me walk you through 6 factors that we know are changing, and I'll talk about how they're influencing. Okay, that clock is, oh, I just can't see it. Okay, we're good on time. So demand. What happens universally, and this is not really unique to the Western civilization or anything, is that as you get richer, you want to eat more livestock products, milk, eggs. Well, eggs would be, livestock, poultry, and then meat. This is showing you here just a graph of every country in the world, what's their GDP per capita, and what's their per capita consumption of meat. You can see the U.S. is exceptional in many ways, of course, but one is in our meat consumption. We eat per capita about 130 kilos of meat per year, and again, that's upwards near 300 plus pounds of meat per year. Now, there's quite variation, right? So Japan eats a lot of fish. They don't eat as much meat. So not everybody's on this line, but you can see quite consistently, as you get richer, you demand more meat. Now, why does that matter? Well, every pound of meat you produce requires more than a pound of feed to that animal, right? Because animals walk around, they use energy. You don't eat the bones, so you have some efficiency ratio. And like, for example, cattle are very relatively inefficient. It takes about 10 pounds of feed to produce a pound of beef. Poultry are better. They're about 2 pounds per pound. But in all of these cases, you're using more grain than you would have if you had just eaten it for the calories and protein directly. So what's happened recently, again, you've probably heard about China getting wealthier. So this just gives you a sense of it. 20 years ago, their per capita GDP was $300. Right now, it's more than 10 times that. So they have really shot up this scale from about down here to over here. And with that comes, say, a doubling of meat consumption per capita. And this has happened in many parts of the world where economies are growing. And this is a good thing. This is what we would expect. But this is really pushing up demand for food. The second one is simply population growth, which often gets left out of the conversation. But it's true that we're continue to grow at about 70 or 80 million people per year. So that's about 1 million people added. This is net, births minus deaths, added every few days. And this just gives you a sense historically of what that looks like. So if you look at population historically, you can get this crazy hockey stick-like figure or a hockey stick lying on its side where it just jumps up all of a sudden. If you look more zoomed in at the recent past, it's actually, you can see that the rates are slowing down, but we continue to grow. So we're about here now, right, 2011. But we continue to grow, It's thought that will level out by mid-century, although that's by no means guaranteed, at about 9 billion. So I said we're about 7 billion now, so we have an additional 2 billion on the way. This is actually not an easy thing to predict, but we know what we would need to know to predict it. We know that really population is driven by the education level of females and the poverty levels, basically the risk of losing your child at birth. And these obviously both go together. So as societies become richer, as they become less worried about their children surviving, they have less children. And this is, again, a universal thing. There are some cultural differences, like if you look at Orthodox Jews or Mormons or some in Islamic communities, but generally you see this around the world. Population slowed down. So one thing about population is the solutions we really know about they have to do with developing and getting richer. Okay, now you mentioned U.S. policy and corn. So here's, I think, my last quiz of the day. What fraction of the corn production, so let me again help you a little bit, or maybe this doesn't help. U.S. produces about 40% of the corn in the world. We're the major corn producer. We have been for a very long time. We export almost half of the total exports in the world. What fraction of our total corn production goes into producing ethanol now? 22, that's very precise. Anyone else? 10%. 10%. I got a nod on 10. Got 20, got 10. Anyone else? 50? 15. Splitting the difference. Anyone else? Okay. Can you guys see this? Okay. This is not the best graph, but you would have been right a few years ago. But it's been increasing quite a bit. And we now, actually, this year are about 40% of our corn crop going into ethanol. Now, the first thing to say is that's as bad as it sounds. The second thing is not as bad as it sounds, because what happens is you take the corn, you make ethanol out of it, you sort of squeeze the juice out, you can think of it that way, and then you're left with kind of the less sweet stuff. I should say that corn is not the corn you're thinking of in terms of sweet corn. It's a different variety of corn. Sorry? Yeah, it's much firmer. It's not the sweet corn that's harvested very early in the season. It dries out. It's very firm. Anyhow, you basically extract all the sugars from that, and you're left with some what we would call distiller grains, and those are actually the cows love to eat that stuff. So you historically have fed like 80% or so of our corn in our country to livestock. Now what you're doing is you're taking a big chunk of that and making ethanol, and then you're getting some of that back. You get about 25 or 30% of that back still to feed to cattle. So thinking about food versus fuel is not quite as correct as thinking about feed versus fuel, because really all our corn in our country is for livestock feed. The fraction directly consumed by us is, despite all the tortilla chips we eat, is very small. So what does this mean? Well, I said the U.S. is the biggest producer of corn. We're taking now 40% of our corn and putting it into our gas tanks. We'll get back to this, but one thing to notice is I've talked about population growth, I've talked about income growth, right? China didn't all of a sudden get richer. Population didn't all of a sudden grow. These are things that have been happening over time. But look at biofuels. It was basically zero. Then what happened was a couple of things. It's an interesting history, but we have a good corn lobby. We had a banning of the former additive to gasoline, which was meant to make it burn cleaner, but we realized it was polluting our groundwater. So corn ethanol was the new ingredient in gasoline. And you can see it went from very small to very large. And if you look a little bit at the timescales of when it really shot up, this should look familiar. It was about 05, 06, 07 when prices started to rise. So there's a qualitative difference between demand that comes on slowly and demand that's unexpected and comes on sharply. This would be similar to your personal lives. I mean, there are expenses you can anticipate, and there are expenses that come out of nowhere. Okay, fourth and quite important factor is that we've, in a way, been a victim of our own success. So we've had this declining prices through time. What that's meant is that countries, foundations, companies are less motivated to invest in continuing to improve the technologies we use to grow food. And we've seen tremendous improvements in technology, but that takes a constant, like any industry, like any sector, it takes constant innovation to keep your pace of growth. And what we've seen, this is just showing you the growth rates in terms of R&D expenditures throughout the world, and they were quite high back in the 70s, something like 7 or 8% per year, and they've shrunk to well below the growth rates of the economy. So countries are shrinking the percentage of their economies that they're putting into investment. This is public. You might think, well, private is making up for the slack, but that's really not true. It's partially true in places like the US. It's very much not true in poorer countries that don't have robust private sectors. So there's been a clear decline up until, say, 5 years ago that in the investment in agriculture worldwide. Now, an important thing about technologies is that they don't just appear overnight. Especially in agriculture, you have to, for example, you have to have, make the crops have sex with each other, grow them out, see how they're doing, cross them again, see how they're doing. It takes time. So typically there's about a 10 or 15-year lag between when you start to work on a technology and if and when it shows up in farmers' fields. Now, what this has meant, this is, I think, partly what this has caused, there's other factors as well, is a slowdown in the growth of the technology. So I talked about the slowing investments. This just shows you the rate of technology growth or the rate of productivity growth in different crops. The red here showing you the historical period, the 60s to the 90s, and the blue showing you since the 90s. And in all of these crops, we've seen a slowdown from about 2% to more like 1%. That's a big, that's a halving of growth rates. And even if you look, this is in terms of yields or productivity per land. If you look at productivity per labor, it has also shrunk quite a bit. What a question?
Are you just talking about technologies, such as breeding and so on, not infrastructure like water?
It includes that. So investment in all of these things that lead to productivity gains have been declining. But certainly the productivity is a function of the crop technology, of the farm technology, of the infrastructure early, of the inputs that you have, the irrigation systems that are one of the main public goods in a lot of these countries. So all of these things I'm talking about. Okay, fifth factor is we have a buffer in the global system, and we've kind of lost that buffer a little bit. This buffer is the storage, the stocks, your pantry basically, but scaled up. Pantries around the world, also big grain silos that you see. We historically have something like 30% of what we use in a year in storage somewhere, maybe a little bit less. But what we've seen over the last decade is that the world stocks have come down quite a lot. Now, these two plots actually emphasize something, which is that most of that drawdown has been in China, because the world excluding China has not really changed very much. And there's some question about the impact of this, because China historically is a very insular country when it comes to food and a few other things, but especially food. And so the use of their stocks, you would think, well, they were holding stocks and then they use their stocks, but they don't go on the markets either way. They're very big on self-sufficiency in grains. That's one side of saying this doesn't really matter. On the other hand, you see in the last few years China coming onto the global markets for the feeds. They're importing about half the soybeans in the world. They're becoming bigger and bigger on the corn imports. And like a lot of things in China, it only takes a small percent, multiplied by 1 billion people. If they start importing corn a little bit from their perspective, it could really have a big effect on the global market. Okay, so the drawdown of stocks, and there's also debate. I mean, these are all things we don't understand perfectly. There's also debate about why these stocks were drawn down. Maybe the food was going bad and they had to use it or something like that. Or maybe they were really running up against production limits and they felt like they needed to do this just to meet their needs. All sorts of issues there. But it's a significant factor in that we're losing a significant buffer in our system. Okay, I said I'll give you 6. And so the 6th factor would be climate change or global warming. Now, this is often in the reports. I showed you all the reports. This is often the headline because it does make for good news. And personally, that's fine with me because this is the area I really focus on. And so it's nice to have attention. But I think it's also important to realize that the 5 factors I've discussed so far are probably more important than climate change, at least so far. Having said that, though, climate change is not a zero factor. Okay, I think we've done a lot of studies, trying to show statistically and rigorously that it's a non-trivial, statistically significant factor in what's going on. This is not the time to get into all those details, I think, but I can't believe nobody laughed at that. Okay, but let me give you the outlines of the story. So one of the things that happened in 2006, 2007 that was mentioned a lot in the price rise at the time was a big drought in Australia. So production was down significantly 30–40% from what it typically is. Now, Australia is not very big. You don't want to tell an Australian that, but it's not a very big player in the global scene, like in terms of population or demand, but they actually are pretty important on the export markets. So there's only, there's a system in place, a global system of trading, and Australia is a big part of that system. Even though they don't produce, they sort of hit above their weight in terms of trade. And so when that export market gets diminished, it has more significant effects potentially on the global markets than it would in, say, another country. So this is one factor. Again, I don't think this was a main factor, but these are all interacting factors. So if you lose a buffer, you have extra demand. And by the way, the biofuel demand is not just an issue of subsidies. It's not like if prices went really high, it would go away. This is an issue of a government mandate. So independent of the price, you have to use 10%. You have to have 10% ethanol in your gasoline. So you have this very rigid demand. You have loss of a buffer, and you get a shock like a drought in Australia. This could have much bigger effects than it would have otherwise. Zooming or fast forwarding, I guess, to the current spike, what we've seen is a few things. We've seen, again, Australia get hit by, this time, floods. And this is kind of one of the characteristics of what we think climate change is about. It's more droughts and more floods. You get hit on both sides of it. Pakistan also had major floods that were in the news a lot. And again, Pakistan, it's a big country. It needs a lot of food. And to get hit like that has an effect on global markets. Many of you probably heard about the big fires and heat wave around Russia. Well, this was their main wheat growing area during the main season, and they lost, again, about 30% of their wheat production to these conditions. They then proceeded, not surprisingly, to slap an export ban on wheat. So they didn't let farmers export wheat, even though the prices were going up, because they wanted to keep domestic prices down. And this is true. I mean, one of the things you forget about living in a country that only spends 6% of their income on food is that in much of the world, the price of food is a huge political issue. And so, for example, in Asia, and India did the same thing back in 2007. They put a rice export ban because they didn't want people rioting because of the price of rice. And what that does is it lowers the price domestically because they don't have to compete with the rest of the world. The farmers lose out, but the consumers win. But it pushes all that instability in prices to the rest of the world because now there's less available on the market. So Russia did this. Price of wheat went up very fast in a matter of weeks. And then you had the corn market follow it, partly because corn is a substitute for wheat, so you can use either when you're feeding, but also because corn supply had some issues. In the US, we saw a hotter than normal summer in August, and that actually caused things to be a lot lower, or significantly lower than people were expecting. And then if you look at this year, I don't know if any of you have been following, but you remember that July heat wave that was on the news a lot? Well, that was the critical period for corn in terms of flowering. Corn is an odd plant where the male and female are separated on the plant. And there's about a 3-day window for a given plant where it sends the pollen from the male to the female. And if it gets really dry or hot, the male sort of shrivels up, the pollen doesn't get to the female, and you don't get an ear. And if you don't get an ear, you can't do much after that. If you don't set the ear, if you don't sort of set the embryo, you can't grow it for the rest of the season. So it's a critical time, and we got this major heat wave. So the jury's still out on this, but the forecast is certainly for lower than normal production, and I think some of us think it's going to be even lower than what the forecast is. So this is already anticipated by the markets a little bit. You've seen prices go up quite a bit. They came down a little bit in September with all the economic concerns, but again, commodity prices are bouncing back pretty quickly. Okay, so which is more important? Now, I don't want to take you through the analysis, but I do want to give you a sense of how we actually analyze this, which is not as easy as you would think. The story I just gave you here, you should all be saying, well, that's a nice story, but where's the analysis? This is hand-waving. This is like what you would read in a newspaper. And you shouldn't be convinced ever by anecdotes. At least as a scientist, that's sort of one of the basic rules is you want to see data. And you want to see not only the data that you select to match your hypothesis, you want to see all the data, and you want to see if it really confirms. So what we do is we try to look at as much data as we possibly can. We try to understand sort of the basic processes that are happening and try to model those situations so that we can then create these artificial worlds in our computer where we say, okay, the world developed except we didn't have the biofuel policy, or the world developed but we didn't have climate change. And we do this as a way of comparing in our computer, well, what would have happened if we did or didn't have this? We also do all sorts of data analysis to compare countries, say, that had certain policies versus others, or countries that had more warming than others. And this is how we scientifically approach it to try to really pinpoint what matters. And when you do all of that, you basically come out with the answer, well, we're not sure. That's the first caveat we always say. But more or less, it looks like biofuels is a major part of the story up to now. I think another big part, but was a little bit more contentious, believe it or not. I mean, academically, it's more contentious maybe is the role of stocks. The biofuels is certainly plenty contentious because of all the interests involved. But historically, I think you add a big inelastic demand, or really totally inelastic because it's a mandate, and at the same time you take out the buffer in the system, then any supply shock is going to drive markets much more than they would have. But that's sort of the short-term volatility question. If you look out longer term, why have we reversed trends since like the late 90s? I think then you look at all of these factors. You look at really tremendous income growth associated with tremendous demand for meat products, population continuing to grow, and climate change. I think since the 1980s we've seen some of these, to give you a sense of it, some of these areas where we grow food, for example, in Europe, in Asia, a normal season right now would be the warmest season in 1980. Okay, so we're about 2 standard deviations in many of these places from what they were experiencing 30 years ago. So it matters. And why does it matter? Well, crops are, they're organisms, and they are affected by weather. In particular, temperatures matter for a whole bunch of reasons. But crops are not that different than you and me in that they like it to be around 70 or 80 degrees. And once it gets to 85 degrees, they start to sweat, or the crop equivalent of sweating, and they don't really do as well. You get up above 90, and remember they don't have air conditioning unless they're irrigated. Then that's sort of a form of air conditioning. But corn in most of the world is not irrigated. Wheat similarly, it becomes an issue. So that's sort of the simple way to think about it. It'd be like sticking one of us out there. We wouldn't like it if it got up to 90 degrees more often. Okay, let's move on to the fourth thing, and we'll wrap up in about 5 minutes. What are the impacts of these higher food prices? Well, on the good side of it, it's the reverse of what I said about being the victim of our success. We can now be the benefits of our own failure, in the sense that prices going up, there's going to be more and more investment in this, and that's both on the private side and the public side. So that is a positive outcome. You can say we're finally valuing food as we should have, if you want to take that view. Now, a second and I would say less positive outcome is that on average, the poorest of the world are going to be hurt. Now, that's not true, exhaustively. So you can, again, come up with anecdotes of this poor farmer who's now making a lot of money because the price of their whatever they're selling went up, and now they're able to send their kids to school, and now they're lifted out of poverty. The fact is that most poor people are in rural areas. Most poor people are involved in agriculture, but most poor people do not produce enough food to feed their families. So they're net buyers of food, even though they're in agriculture. So it's one of these ironies that most of the food insecure people in the world are very close to food. There's just not enough of it there, and they don't have the incomes to buy more food. So you get some winners, especially in a place like China, where people own a lot of their own land. But in a lot of the world, especially in Latin America, for example, you see most of the poor either don't own land or they're in the urban slums. And these are the people that are hurt quite a bit when food goes up. So the net balance is that right now, given the structure of poverty and food insecurity, prices go up, food insecurity goes up. And there's been estimates of how many, it's 50 million, say, or 100 million. You can look to the World Bank press releases to see that. And then a third and important one is that I won't have time to really get into, and this is also contentious, is that when the price of food goes up, there's much more incentive to clear native habitat. So there's much more incentive. Malaysia, for example, issued a press release that they were designating like 1 million hectares for agricultural development, and that's code for whacking out the trees and putting in crops. And you can say, oh, that's a totally reasonable thing to do, and maybe it is, but it certainly has environmental consequences. That's something our center is really interested in, because the global food challenge is not so much to feed people. If that was our only goal, it wouldn't be so hard, but it's to feed people, it's to provide energy, and it's to maintain some semblance of an environment that we want. And this is sort of the challenge. So the higher prices do provide more incentive for deforestation or clearing of land. Another impact, which is again contentious, being discussed a lot, there's a lot of meetings and committees on this, is that we see let's say a curious correlation between the price of food or the change in the price of food and the amount of unrest around the world. So this is showing you, again, that a zoom up of the prices that I showed you before. This is the peak in 07, 08, and then the peak currently. And these red lines show you the amount of deadly riots throughout the world. And for example, the Arab Spring is over here. Egypt, 800 plus people died. Libya. And this group is making a big deal out of the fact that this blue line shows you when they started warning, well, the prices are back up where they were. We're probably going to see lots of riots. And they sent some letter to the government, and then you saw all of the riots in the spring. So they're very proud of themselves. But this is not science, I would say. This is not good science, at least. This is not really rigorously testing, because there's a lot of other things changing then. There was a lot of other factors. But we can't discount the fact that people want food. Again, this is a big political issue around the world, and it shouldn't be too surprising that unrest goes up as prices go up. So this is why the State Department, this is why you see Hillary Clinton often going around saying food is very important, poverty is very important, because they're increasingly concerned about these things. And FSI here is increasingly studying these things, FSI, the Freeman Spogli Institute. Okay, now the last point, after I do a quick summary. Food prices can change. That's one of the lessons. And that's because we have inelastic demand and supply. We've seen increases in prices, mainly due to biofuels and stocks, I would say. But in the longer term, there's been lots of different factors, and these are the things to watch out for the future. And the plus side of this is that there's more attention being paid to agriculture now. You could argue that this is going to be, in the end, a net positive because of that. But on the other hand, there's definitely, it's like Keane said, in the long run, we're all dead. So in the long run, for food insecure people, it's a week or two. If the prices go up, they're really struggling. Okay, now let me just say one word about the future, which is that all these 6 factors I discussed, it's hard to see any of them becoming much better, with maybe the exception of the stocks. I mean, it takes a couple good harvests, and you could build those up maybe. But incomes continue to grow, maybe not as fast as they were. But this is a good thing. Again, standard of living is improving around the world. Population continues to grow. The biofuel demand it seems really hard to see that going away. But we can't predict policy. But it seems that there's a lot of interest in keeping it there. Climate change is certainly not going away, despite what you may have heard. We could certainly get a few positive years, a few cool years. But the trends are, if anything, worse than we thought. The investment has certainly been picking up, but there's a lag, as I said, in the investment. So in a sense, the next 10 years are going to be, the technology growth is going to be reflecting what we've invested over the last 10 years, not necessarily what we start investing now. So all of these factors, I think, are going to continue to push prices higher in the future. Let me just say that it's not all bad news, but I do want to leave you with the impression that all the factors are sort of pushing food to be more important in the future. At the same time, you're going to get big investment. You're going to get potentially improvements on policies. You could, I say, get better policies on energy or climate or agriculture. And as I said before, we could see a temporary reprieve, maybe because of a big recession, which is not much of a consolation prize. You could see the weather unusually good for a few years. That helps us rebuild stocks. You could see a major new technology come on board. And it doesn't have to necessarily be crop technology. As I said before, it could be, energy policy is really driving food prices. If we see a huge energy technology like a battery that can really explode the battery powered car market, that could have a significant effect on food. So although the trends are towards higher prices, you can never rule out these positive surprises. And if there's anything that I should leave you with, is that it always helps to have luck, and you should know that by now. Okay.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.